Okay, this is the second lecture, and we're starting out with ancient Egyptian art. So we're skipping kind of a lot in a way, but even though we're talking about Western art, we do have to start in Africa because the art and culture of Egypt has a big effect on what is considered to be Western art. So normally when I do this in a in-person class, we do this on a sheet of graph paper that I hand out, and it's to show you how the Egyptians made their drawings. So they made their drawings with a very, very precise canon of proportions. And it would change throughout the 3,000 years of history that we're going to look at with Egypt, but it would always be very precise. And depending on how important you were, the more precise it would be. So if you look at this image, you can see that all of these units that I have set up exactly work on this Old Kingdom pharaoh. So the last question I asked is if you notice anything that's strange about the figure. And the thing that people don't usually notice, but is very strange, is that this king has 2 right feet. So in the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians thought that important people should be shown by their most characteristic angle. So for feet, it meant big toe first. So if he's facing this way, we'll see he'll have 2 right feet. If he was facing the other way, he would have 2 left feet. So most of you probably know who this guy is without me telling you. It's King Tutankhamun. And this is the funeral mass that would have gone directly over his mummy. You can see the dates there. We'll be talking about his reign a little bit later on. So why is King Tut so famous? He was actually a very minor king, but his tomb, unlike other pharaohs' tombs, was undisturbed and intact. The tombs of more important kings, had they not been robbed, would have certainly been more impressive. So later on, we'll talk about kings like Ramses II. And at that time in the New Kingdom, they buried people in what's called the Valley of the Kings. They basically made these man-made caves to try to hide the tombs. And it wasn't successful at all. All of the tombs were robbed. And it was only luck that Tut's tomb wasn't robbed and was able to survive through today. So because he was such a minor king, the stuff that was inside was very, very impressive. So you can imagine that the now empty tombs of someone very important, like Ramses II, would have had treasures and riches beyond what we could possibly imagine. So his name, and all of the ancient pharaohs have these types of names. His name translates to living image of Amen. Whenever you see the names of pharaohs mentioned in popular culture, what they're talking about is the Horus name, but all of the pharaohs have multiple names. So this is a map of the world, and usually I ask the students what they think of this map, because sometimes when you have a map of the world, they use what's called the Mercator Projection. And that type of map shows things like Greenland as being huge and the global south as being very small. And you can imagine why it would look that way when you project something on a flat surface that is round. You do have to make some decisions. And with the Mercator projection, since the people that made it were from Europe, they were making decisions to emphasize the northern part of the world. So this kind of map I like a lot better because even though it's not perfect, it's not a globe, it still gives you an idea of proportions. It shows Africa as being very huge and South America as being very huge. So ancient Egypt. Egypt is in the continent of Africa. You can see it right there. Just in case you didn't know, it's in Africa. So this one's called the Gift of the Nile because Egypt is actually mostly empty desert. And it had been that way since about 3000 BC. So at the beginning of the time period we're going to talk about. All life in cities are based around the Nile and its annual flooding cycles. So you can see all of the ancient, some of which are also modern cities along the Nile here. And it's desert, 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 desert. And the ancient Egyptians, they actually called their land Kemet, which means the black land. So what happens is every year the Nile floods, and then in that floodplain is some very fertile land that you can grow crops in. So they call that the black land, as in the fertile land. And then Deshret means the red land, and that means the desert that is outside of the floodplain of the Nile. So this kind of dichotomy between two different areas, the civilized area, which is Kemet, and the uncivilized area or wilderness, which is Deshret, is something that you'll see appear in Egyptian art. Another type of theme where they talk about geography in ancient Egyptian art is the idea of Upper and Lower Egypt. So the Nile runs from the highlands all the way in Ethiopia downwards into the lowlands where it meets the Mediterranean Sea at the delta. So even though on this map, Upper Egypt is below and Lower Egypt is above, you can see why they call it Upper Egypt, as in high elevation, and then Lower Egypt in low elevation. So since the beginning of the Pharaonic era, so about 3000 BCE, it was thought that the kings had united these warring kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt. So we'll see lots of artistic themes that have to do with uniting those two parts of Egypt. So I show the Google map so you can get an idea. Yes, it's still that way today. There are dams to control the flooding of the Nile, but we still have lots of desert until we get to Libya, and lots of desert on this side as well. So still today, ancient Egypt is built around the Nile, or modern Egypt is built around the Nile. So the religion of ancient Egyptians is very complex and it changes through time. So this is just a summary. Their religion is polytheistic, which means literally multiple gods. And according to Adams, they influenced human lives and ordered the universe. And we'll see some of those themes as we go along. Some of the gods are in animal and human form, some in both. And many of the local gods, in other words, ones that were probably before the Pharaonic era that were worshipped by people locally, they became national whenever usually it's attached to the pharaoh. So Horus became attached to the pharaoh, protecting him. So he became a national god. There's a pantheon. You don't have to know that stuff for this class, but if you're interested, you can look it up and find out about all the pantheons. What we're going to see in both the culture, the religions, and the art is the idea of syncretism. And we'll see this throughout the class in many other cultures. The idea with syncretism is a synthesis. In other words, most cultures, whenever they develop their religions, especially in these kind of advanced cultures like Egypt, they are taking from many different cultures and then incorporating them into their own. So the Egyptians did that as well, and then many people did it with Egyptian gods later on. We'll see that with the ancient Greeks. So it means incorporating deities from various cultures. So this is a lot on this slide, but don't worry, you don't have to know all of it. The idea is just give you a impression of the incredible span of time that we're talking about when we talk about ancient Egypt. So the pre-dynastic period, we're not even going to look at that stuff. I don't think it's particularly important for this class. We'll start with the early dynastic period. In other words, when they have pharaohs and according to Egyptian legends, Upper and Lower Egypt were united. We don't know if that's a historical fact. So the rest of these time periods are broken into different types of time periods. So Old Kingdom means when Upper and Lower Egypt were united into one kingdom. So when you have kingdoms, that means there's one Egypt. That's roughly similar to the modern borders of Egypt. And then the intermediate periods are when Egypt was broken up into different parts, or especially in the third intermediate period, when they were taken over by foreign conquerors. So we're just going to look at, since it's not an Egyptian art class, the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. Sometimes you'll see different dates for these, and that depends not for the later kingdoms, but for the Old Kingdom. And that's because the old Egyptian calendar didn't include leap years until the New Kingdom. So the dates in the Old Kingdom are sometimes thought to be 100 years later than this. So if you look at this, the time period is kind of amazing. We have the first pharaoh we're going to look at from about 3000 BCE, so 5,000 years ago, until about the year 0. So the late dynastic period, we're not really going to talk about that in this class. I teach an African class also at Henry Ford where you can learn about that. And then it was taken over by Persian kings. And then eventually it was conquered by Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And Alexander the Great gave one of his generals named Ptolemy control of Egypt. And Ptolemy said, I'm going to rule as a pharaoh. So he had Egyptian artists make him images that showed him as an Egyptian pharaoh. So for the rest of the time until about the year 0, ancient Egypt was ruled by Greek rulers, but they all ruled as if they were Egyptian kings and queens. So all of the male descendants of Ptolemy were called Ptolemy. So Ptolemy 1, 2, 3. And then all of the female descendants were called Cleopatra. And if you're thinking of the historical Cleopatra in your head right now, that is the last queen of Egypt. But remember, she's Greek, and her name is Cleopatra the 7th. So try to imagine what this time period is when we have the art that's going to look pretty similar. It's 3,000 years. And just to give you an idea of what that means, Cleopatra the 7th is closer in time to us in 2020 than Cleopatra is to the pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids. So this is an incredible span of time. And just think about what 3,000 years ago is. That's 1000 BCE. Just almost an impossible length of time to conceive of. So as far as ancient Egyptian history, the most important figure is the pharaoh, meaning great house. And the early pharaohs established their divinity. Sometimes I have students ask, how did they convince people that they were gods? I'm not sure if they did, but they did create imagery to say that they were. So what survives of Egypt are the tombs of the pharaoh and other important people. So tombs are meant to be eternal. They were made of stone. The cities were made of mud, brick, and wood, and those are long gone. So early pharaohs expected to live in the afterlife as they did in life. Providing for the afterlife in advance allowed people to anticipate, and when they're talking about people, we're talking about elites, anticipate active, happy lives relatively free from the fear of the great unknown, because they knew that their cause would enjoy the same pleasure as they did in life. The ka is the spirit of the dead king, but in later times, other people thought of themselves as having a ka. So think about this. If you're looking for something to do on an extra credit board, look at what I've talked about on this slide. So what is missing from Egyptian history? And I can give you a hint. Ask yourself if you or anyone you know is royalty or some other type of elite wealthy person. Okay, so try that on the extra credit board and I'll see what pops out. So the characteristics of Egyptian art, remember this is 3,000 years. It's kind of amazing things that endure and it is continuous, but it's not static. So the basic pattern of Egyptian institutions, beliefs, and artistic ideas were formed during the first few centuries of that vast time span, was maintained until the end. And we're gonna look at each of these characteristics that follow in the earliest work of art that we're going to look at from ancient Egypt. So don't worry if you don't know what these are yet. I'm going to show you in a moment. So the composite view, I'll show you on that image. That's the easiest way to do it. Hieroglyphics, which means sacred writing in Greek. The images in Egyptian art are meaningless without the writing, which activates their spiritual power. So the art of ancient Egypt, it has a purpose, not just to look good, it's to preserve the ka of the king or other elites. So what hieroglyphics do is they are spiritual writing. They release the power of these works of art to serve the function that they're trying to serve. So hieroglyphics is the first type of writing that's developed in ancient Egypt, but it's not an everyday writing that is used later on. It's just used for these spiritual purposes. So hierarchic scale, and again, we'll see examples of this. More important people or objects are larger or at the top. And then registers. That's kind of like comic books, and we'll see how that works in a moment. So we're looking at here is the oldest historical artwork. And if then in the last lecture, you thought about what does historical mean, I'll tell you what it means now. It means an era of writing. So this is the oldest artwork that has writing on it. And if you look around, you should be able to find some of the writing. They're very early hieroglyphics. So you can do it on your own and pause it. And then I'll show you some of the hieroglyphics. So we got this one right here. We have another one here, and then one up here. At the top, this is called a Serach. And this area right here, it represents the palace of the king. And in the Old Kingdom, this is how the names were stamped onto art. And what it says in here, the hieroglyphics say Narmer. So this is the palette of King Narmer. And it's also not only the oldest historical artwork. There was writing before this, but not on art. The oldest portrayal of a named individual. So Narmer is our named individual. You can see some things that are going on here on the front right away as far as the characteristics of Egyptian art. So Narmer, he wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. When we look at the backside, we'll see the other crown. Horus is the god of Upper Egypt, portrayed right here. And the papyrus plants symbolize Lower Egypt. So what you're seeing here basically is Horus, who's associated with the kings. And the early kings most likely came from Upper Egypt. And they are conquering the people of Lower Egypt and bringing Egypt together. So that's basically, this is almost like a hieroglyph in a way. And it says Upper and Lower Egypt were united by the people from Lower Egypt conquering, or the people from Upper Egypt conquering the people of Lower Egypt. So as far as composite view, that's a little difficult to explain, but hopefully we can. If you look at the Pharaoh here, you can see that the way that he's shown isn't really natural. Like a human being couldn't be like this. The most obvious is the eyes are shown from the front, but the face is shown in profile. The chest is shown from the front, and then the arms are shown in profile, and then same thing with the hips and the legs. And the idea with that is that the ancient Egyptians believed that there was a characteristic view for each body part. And so instead of trying to create something naturalistic, meaning something that looks like real life, they're more interested in showing each body part in its best way. So they believed the profile of the face was the best way, but the front of the eye was the best way. So that means a composite view. You take a composite of different views and put them together onto one figure. So hieroglyphics, we already looked at some of those. Hierarchic scale. So how hierarchic scale works is the largest is the most important. So in this one, we see the Pharaoh. He's the most important. The second largest, his enemy that he's smiting right here, is the second most important. And then the Pharaoh's assistant right here isn't supposed to represent a very small person. It's just that he's less important. So an important thing to know about hierarchic scale, though, is that it only works between these register lines. So in between these lines, you have the logic of hierarchic scale. If you have different lines, then you're talking about a different logic of hierarchic scale. So the king is usually portrayed in a more stylized and rigid way. Basically, the more important you are, the more stylized, meaning less realistic, and more rigid you are. And the idea with that is to show the king as something that is eternal and separate from the rest of us. A couple of other things you'll notice is we have enemies here and enemies here. The reason why you can tell that they're enemies is that they are not clothed. So if you're not wearing clothing in ancient Egypt, that means you're an enemy. It's not going to be the same in other works of art. And then the other thing is, instead of being showing rigid, like these two figures, like the Pharaoh and his assistant, instead we're seeing them as twisted. So that also shows that they're an enemy. So the other side, we can explain hierarchic scale a little bit better. In between these two register lines, we can see that the king, and he's wearing the red crown now, is the most important. And then as the figures get smaller and smaller, they're less and less important. But if you notice, in between these two register lines, we have two figures that aren't particularly important, that are actually larger than the pharaoh up here, but that doesn't matter because it only counts in between these two lines. And then below, we can see another enemy. We can tell because he's not clothed and he's twisted. So if you look closely, this part is a little bit gruesome, but it gives you an idea of how the pharaoh was able to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. You can see there's a bunch of beheaded figures, and they have their heads between their legs. So most people that are ruling empires, they're doing so through violence, and the pharaoh is showing here that he's willing to do that. So a bull is represented multiple times, both on this side of the palette and on the other side of the palette. And the bull represents the pharaoh. It's a particular type of male power for the pharaoh. But this is important for the Egyptians, particularly because they are an agricultural society, and they do raise cattle, and cattle is a symbol of wealth. If the cattle are doing well, it also tells you that Egypt is doing well. And if you're familiar with the Christian Bible and the Old Testament and the story of Exodus, they talk about the Pharaoh having dreams of famine, and how those dreams are shown is in these very skinny cattle. So the Pharaoh very early on kind of represented himself as one that brings fecundity, which is a word that means everybody has plenty of food, everything's growing, everybody's happy and safe. So he's associated with the bull, not just because of male power, but also because of the bull is a symbol of how well Egypt is doing. And the pharaoh likes to think of himself as the one that brings life and happiness to Egypt.